Well, the controversial future of Lester Park Golf Course continues in Duluth, and now a lawsuit is making the issue even more challenging. A petition to put the issue to a vote on the November ballot is now moving through the courts as city leaders address the topic ahead of their meeting tomorrow night. Northern News Now's Leslie Krebs spoke to both sides and shares what's in the lawsuit and the motivation behind it. Leslie?
Michael Bernstein has been gathering signatures in a petition to force a public vote on the future of Lester Park Golf Course. However, some council members say the vote itself would be illegal and the petition is not valid according to state law.
Whatever happens on tomorrow will still be before the judge.
Michael Bernstein stands before City Hall ready to defend a petition he and more than 5,000 other Duluth residents signed to give residents a voice in what happens to the Lester Park Golf Course.
There's a lot of people motivated and activated about this issue. They just want their voices heard. They just want their signatures counted.
Bernstein has now filed a lawsuit against the city of Duluth, the city council, and the city clerk. He claims the city clerk left out petition signatures in order to prevent his petition from being on the November ballot.
I think it's a really serious undercutting of democracy, and I don't think that's what Duluthians deserve.
The petition would put the future of the former Lester Park Golf Course to a public vote. However, Councilmember Eric Forsman says despite their efforts, the ballot question about the future of Lester Park is not in accordance with state law.
The city attorney has said is that these petition questions, unfortunately, for those who worked on them, are not valid by law.
Saying in a perfect world, residents would have a say, but in this scenario, it's not possible to vote on it.
It has nothing to do with whether I think the golf course should be redeveloped or not. It's whether the city has the legal ability to put these questions forward to voters or not.
As of last Friday, Bernstein says he was told by the city that their petitions remain illegal, but he's not giving up yet.
It should be the public choice, not the choice of 9 people on the city council.
The city of Duluth has launched a public input survey regarding the park's future. It comes after the city council adopted a resolution last year calling for a balance of outdoor recreation, natural resource preservation, and housing development at the site. Tomorrow's council meeting is expected to discuss what happens next regarding the petitions. We'll be at that meeting and bring you updates. In the studio, Leslie Krebs, Northern News Now.